So I'm going to be reporting on a research project I'm working on with Bart Wednesday at UCL, who's also actually here in the audience. And I want to give you the core idea in this project we're working on, which is about AI trust and perceptions of agency. If you find it interesting, you can find the early version of this paper on SSRN, where the arguments are developed in a bit more detail. Very quick overview of what we're talking about here. So in particular, we're really talking about the aspect of AI which goes under the label of deep learning. So this is the relatively recent advances in extremely nonlinear polynomial function fitting with large data sets and very high predictive accuracy. And that's generally seen as a fairly transformative technology which has had inroads into various different sectors. In some sense, you can say this is a very fundamental decision technological innovation, because all decisions rely on predictions. And if you can make good predictions, you can make good decisions. So that's the reason why deep learning and AI has become such a big deal in various business contexts and non-business contexts as well. Now, of course, for these developments to be useful to people, they have to trust them, right? There has to be a degree of trust in how humans use the results coming out of these algorithms. And that cannot be taken for granted. So there's now a fairly well-established body of research showing that humans often distrust decision technologies. These have been studied under the names of concepts like algorithm aversion. And the idea is that even when you have an algorithm that reliably produces better recommendations than the users themselves could, there is some sort of inertia around actually accepting these recommendations. So this barrier between the human and the algorithm in terms of trust is kind of an important one in our view to think more carefully about, to understand why it's there and what we could do to reduce it where it makes sense to reduce it. Not always the case, but where it does make sense to reduce it, what could we do as a design intervention to try and reduce that barrier? Our main point in this paper, which is developed in more depth in the paper, is that there is something fundamentally different about trust in AI versus any technology. Okay, and the basic difference here that we want to highlight is that there is a degree of agentic attribution to the technology itself rather than its designer, which is typically more than what you would attribute to a typical technology and perhaps less than what you would attribute to fellow humans. That's what makes AI sometimes look quite different when it comes to the problem of trust. So the classic definition of trust, which Laura already referenced, is the one we are using as well. That definition, which is widespread in the social sciences, makes quite clear that without agency, there is no trust. And you need it on both sides, both on the side of the truster and the trustee, at least to some degree. Now, for a typical technology, there isn't much agency in the technology itself. So it's clearly the puppeteer who's the object of our trust. But what happens with AI, we argue, is that sometimes the strings in this picture become invisible because the technology acts in ways that suggest it has agency of its own. And that changes the focus of where the individual is ascribing trustworthiness and is attributing trust into the system. And that can make a big difference to how one goes about perceiving whether the system is in fact trustworthy or not. So here's a way to explain the idea very simply. If you think about an AI which has very low perceived agency, so think about lines of code, right? This is literally embodied in some software and you can see it running on a screen if you like. Then the only thing that really matters in determining trust in this AI is actually the trustworthiness of the designer. So this is really a problem of attribution of trust and trustworthiness to the agent who created this system. But the system itself is not in the discussion. However, if you tune up the level of perceived agency in this system to something that looks a bit more like this, then two things happen, and both are important. First is a different set of relationships now become important. And the key relationships here are between the trustworthiness of the technology itself, which should, of course, increase trust in this algorithm, but also the fact that because there is higher perception of agency, one has to take into account the tendency called betrayal aversion. So there's a very beautiful line of work by Respondent and others, which shows that all else being equal, the disutility of being ripped off in some sense by an agent as opposed to by random chance is systematically higher. So this betrayal aversion phenomenon is actually going to come into play the moment we attribute agency to the system And that's not the case when you're just looking at an inanimate technology. So this regime switch that happens when you ramp up the perception of agency in the AI, we think can make a pretty big difference. Among other things, one of the most important implications is that the interventions that we often see in use nowadays to try and increase perceptions of AI's agency. This could be autonomy, it could be anthropomorphization, giving these systems a name, a gender, and a voice. These may actually backfire. They can lower trust in AI unless perception of the AI's trustworthiness is already high or the designer's trustworthiness is already low. So the normative implication here is quite simple. If you want to increase trust in AI, then you might do it by increasing perceptions of its trustworthiness, improving attributions of competence or benevolence, or you might actually work to decrease perceptions of how agentic it is and simultaneously ramp up perceptions of the designer's trustworthiness. So essentially, that's the delicate dance we think determines human trust in AI, unlike the case of humans trusting other humans, where the default assumption is there is agency. And in the case of humans trusting technology, where the default assumption is there isn't any agency. So AI, because it sits between these two, produces a unique set of challenges and possibly a different menu of interventions. Let me stop there. Thank you.